Let's get honest about what's really going on when you face a necessary assumption question on the LSAT. You read the stimulus, you think you understand the argument, and you move on to the answer choices. And suddenly, you're second guessing everything. One choice sounds too obvious. Another sounds too strong. Another brings up something you didn't even think about. So you pick the one that sounds closest and you pray it's right. That is what I call LSAT fog. The feeling of being technically capable, but mentally lost. You know that you should understand the question, but somehow it keeps slipping through your fingers. Here's what no one tells you. Necessary assumption questions aren't hard because they're advanced. They're hard because they exploit how most people intuitively think about arguments and flip it upside down. Most students think arguments are about proving something. So naturally, when they get to an assumption question, they start looking for the choice that strengthens the conclusion. But that's not what a necessary assumption question is asking. It's not about what would make the argument stronger or what else would be good to know. It's not even what's probably true. It's what absolutely must be true in order for the argument not to fall apart completely. If it's not there, the argument dies. That's it. No room for nice to have. No room for helpful additions. It's structural, like a support beam in a building. If you walked into a house and saw a beam holding up the ceiling, would you ask, would the house be better with this beam? No. You'd ask, would the house stand without this beam? That's how you have to approach necessary assumption questions. And once you lock in that mindset, these questions get a whole lot easier because you're not chasing 5 answer choices. You're hunting for one thing, that necessary structural support beam. And here's why this shift matters so much. Most LSAT prep companies teach necessary assumption and sufficient assumption questions as if they're cousins or siblings. They're not. They don't ask the same question and they don't require the same mindset. And confusing them is one of the fastest ways to get stuck in a plateau in the 150s or the 160s. And when students come to me feeling stuck, 9 times out of 10, they're treating these assumption question types as if they're interchangeable, but they're not. Necessary assumption is about what must be true, not what makes it true or what helps it be true. So if you've been spinning your wheels on these, the problem isn't that you're bad at logic or not analytical enough. The problem is that no one showed you how to think like the test makers. Once you internalize the right framework, the idea of arguments depending on hidden support beams, you can walk into these questions with a calm and confident approach. No more guessing, no more fog, just a simple question. What has to be true for this argument to even work? That is the game, and you can learn it. So let's strip away the LSAT jargon and talk real-world logic here. You hear the word assumption, and you probably think, oh, that's something the argument believes. Close, but not quite. On the LSAT, especially in necessary assumption questions, it's a lot more precise than that. Here's the real definition. A necessary assumption is something the author didn't say, but must secretly believe, because if it weren't true, the argument would fall apart. So let's break this down with a metaphor that actually works. Imagine a bridge. On one side, you've got the evidence, what the argument tells you directly. On the other side, you've got the conclusion, what the author wants you to believe. And underneath it all, you've got assumptions, the support beams holding up the entire bridge. Without the beams, the two sides don't connect, the bridge collapses, and the argument falls apart. That is exactly what necessary assumption questions test. This is not a bonus, not a strengthener, it is a requirement. And the biggest mistake I see is when people confuse necessary assumptions with sufficient assumptions. They read the question and they go, oh, I know what would make this argument better, but that is the wrong test. Necessary assumptions aren't about making the argument better, it's about preventing it from collapsing. It's the bare minimum that must be true, nothing more. So think of it this way. If you removed this assumption, would the whole argument become nonsense? If yes, then you found your necessary assumption. If not, you've got to keep looking. So let's say a doctor said to you, You have strep throat, so I'm prescribing antibiotics. What's the assumption? That you're not allergic to antibiotics. The doctor didn't say it explicitly, but if it weren't true, the recommendation could be dangerous. That is a necessary assumption. It's not something extra, it's something essential. So in plain English, what they're really asking is, what has to be true for this argument to even work at a basic level? Not what might help, not what could be nice, not what would make the conclusion stronger, just what beam holds up this bridge. That's the lens you need for every single necessary assumption question. And if you can keep that lens on, you've already done 80% of the work. Now, let's talk pattern recognition. If you're spending time wondering, what kind of question is this, you're already behind. The LSAT rewards speed and certainty. The faster you identify the type, the faster you can switch into the right mental model. So here's the shortcut. The question stem always tells you exactly what kind of assumption they want. You've just got to read it the right way. When you see a question stem that says something like, which one of the following assumptions is required for the argument to hold, or the argument depends upon which one of the following, or the argument relies on the assumption, these are not random synonyms. They're code. Required, depends upon, relies on, they're all LSAT language for tell us what must be true for this argument not to fall apart. That word, necessary, or anything close to it or synonymous with it, is your green light. And sometimes the LSAT will use a vague term like the argument assumes that, and this can be frustrating because that single word, assumes or assumption, could be used in both necessary and sufficient assumption questions. So how do you tell which one you're looking at? You look for the strength of the language. If the question is talking about something that the argument needs, requires, depends upon, or assumes, it is necessary. However, if they're talking about something that, if true, would guarantee the conclusion or enable the conclusion to logically follow, you're looking at sufficient assumption. Big difference. Necessary must be true. Sufficient makes the argument 100% true. If that sounds subtle, it is. But once you start reading stems with this filter, it becomes second nature. Now, most students treat necessary assumption questions like a mystery, but they're not. They follow a very tight structure, and once you understand it, the choices stop feeling random. Every necessary assumption answer, yes, every single one, falls into one of two categories. It's either a connector or a blocker. And this is not theory, it's not abstract LSAT philosophy. This is what the test writers are literally doing when they write these questions. So the first type is the connector. That is like a missing puzzle piece. This assumption fills a gap in the argument. The author has made a leap, jumping from some evidence to a conclusion without properly connecting the two. The connector assumption is the unstated glue that helps to fill in that gap. So let's take a basic example. Let's say you had an argument where the premise is all marathon runners have excellent stamina. Conclusion, Jenna has excellent stamina, so she must be a marathon runner. Sounds logical at first glance until you pause. Couldn't other people have excellent stamina too? Like swimmers, soccer players, Navy SEALs. The argument here is assuming something it never says out loud, like only marathon runners have excellent stamina. That is a connector assumption. It bridges the gap the author casually skipped over. And this is the most common type of necessary assumption. And once you know to look for that leap, these start to feel almost mechanical. Now, the second type is the blocker, which is like a silent bodyguard, because sometimes the argument itself feels structurally sound, but it is vulnerable to attack. There might not be anything glaringly wrong with the internal logic, but there is a threat lurking outside the argument that could undermine it. The blocker assumption is the silent protection against that threat. So here's a new example. Premise, we should buy new software because it'll increase productivity. Conclusion, therefore, it's a good business decision to buy the software. But wait, what if the software cost $1 million? That could completely ruin the logic. Productivity gains don't matter if the cost outweighs them. So the necessary assumption could be something like the software is affordable, or the cost of the software doesn't cancel out the productivity benefits. That is a blocker assumption. It's not connecting two ideas, it is neutralizing a potential objection. You'll see these a lot, of course, in real-world arguments too. Anytime someone argues for a plan, they're almost always assuming that nothing will go wrong. That itself is a blocker. So when you get to a necessary assumption question, ask yourself this. Is there something missing between the premise and the conclusion? Is there some new term or phrase in the conclusion or idea that did not appear in the evidence? If so, you're probably looking for a connector. However, if there is something outside the argument that could make this a bad idea, then you're looking for a blocker. And the good news is, you don't have to guess. You just read the argument and look for either a leap or a threat, and then you predict the type of assumption you'll need to fix it. And once you lock this mental model in place, the choices stop being 5 confusing paragraphs and start being 2 categories you already know how to deal with. Now let's stop pretending the LSAT's about tricks or hacks, because it's really about process. If you're relying on vibes or intuition when answering necessary assumption questions, you'll keep getting stuck. You'll pick answers that sound pretty good, but don't actually hold the argument up. So here is a no guesswork step-by-step method you can use for every necessary assumption question. It's clean, it's simple, and it works. First step is to find the conclusion. This is the first and most important step, and most students mess it up. The LSAT is not going to label the conclusion for you. Sometimes it's at the end, or at the beginning, or buried in the middle. But you can't evaluate an assumption unless you know what the author is actually trying to prove. So ask yourself, if the author had to sum up their point in one sentence, what would it be? That is your conclusion, and the rest is setup. Then step 2, find the premise or premises. That's the evidence. It's the reasons the author gives to support that conclusion. This might be one sentence, or it could be several. Look for keywords like because, since, or after all. These often signal that what follows is support, not the main point. And you don't need to analyze these too deeply yet, just find them. Then step 3, spot the gap. And this is where the magic starts. Once you've got the conclusion and the premises, ask, does the evidence guarantee the conclusion? If the answer is no, and it always is no, then there is a gap. Something is missing. The author is assuming something without saying it, and your job is to find it. That gap could be a leap in logic, in which case you need a connector, or it could be a potential risk, in which case you need a blocker. This is where you move from passive reading to active diagnosis. You are no longer absorbing, you are interrogating the argument. Then step 4, predict the assumption. Once you have identified the gap, try to predict what would need to be true to make the conclusion work. Is it a connector that fills in the missing link, or is it a blocker that protects against a threat? This doesn't have to be perfect, but if you can ballpark what kind of idea you need, what must be true for the argument not to collapse, then the choices get way easier to scan. Most students go straight to the choices and get overwhelmed, but if you predict first, you'll immediately spot which ones are trash, and often you'll spot the right one without even getting through all 5 choices. Then step 5, use the negation test. This is your quality control. It's your confirmation step. And here's how it works. You take the answer choice you're considering. You negate it to make it not true. And you're asking here, if this weren't true, would the argument fall apart? If yes, it's necessary and you can eliminate it. For example, let's say the answer is, the new policy will not reduce employee morale. Negated, it becomes, the new policy will reduce employee morale. Now you ask, would that ruin the conclusion? If the conclusion says, this policy will improve productivity, and now morale is crashing, that probably kills the argument. That is a necessary assumption. The beauty of the negation test is that it gives you certainty, not just a good feeling. Because you're no longer choosing from answers that sound kind of right. You're verifying them, and that's how you separate high scorers from everyone else. This process, conclusion, premises, gap, predict, and negate, is a repeatable 5-step system that you can run like a checklist every single time. And once you do, you'll stop falling into traps, you'll stop second guessing, and you'll start answering with speed and confidence. Now let's say you followed all the steps. You found the conclusion, you found the premises, you spotted the gap, and you even predicted the assumption. But then You read the answer choices and it all still falls apart. Why? Because LSAT answer choices are strategically designed to confuse you, not just distract you, but to trick you. They know your instincts and they know what sounds close enough, and they use that against you. Here are the 5 most common traps and how to dodge them like a pro. The first big trap is out-of-scope answers, and this one's simple. The answer brings in something totally irrelevant. At first, it might sound intelligent or even helpful, but if it brings up a new concept, one that wasn't in the stimulus at all, it cannot be necessary. Example, let's say you had an argument where it said, switching to solar panels will reduce electricity bills, and the choice said, solar panels are environmentally sustainable. Sounds nice, but it's totally irrelevant. The argument was about money, not sustainability. So the fix here is to ask, is this something the author even mentioned or implied? If not, you want to eliminate it without any hesitation. The second big trap is opposite answers. This one looks logical, but it cuts in the wrong direction. It actively hurts the argument rather than helping it. And because you're looking for something important or impactful, your brain might latch onto it. But remember, if an answer weakens the argument, it cannot be something the argument depends on. For example, if the argument said, hiring more staff will increase customer satisfaction, and the choice said, hiring more staff will overwhelm management and reduce efficiency, even if that's true in the real world, it's the opposite of helpful in this argument. So your fix for this trap is, if an answer would make the argument worse, you want to throw it out immediately. The author would never assume something that undermines their own point. The third big trap is extreme language. You want to watch out for words like always, never, only, must, completely, and entirely. Why? Because necessary assumptions are usually weak. They don't have to cover every scenario. They've just got to be true enough for the argument to hold up. So if the argument isn't extreme, but the answer is, that's a red flag. For example, if we had an argument saying, increasing the ad budget will likely increase sales, and the answer said, sales must increase anytime the ad budget increases, that answer is way too strong. That's not necessary, that's sufficient, and not even really a good one. So your fix for this trap is to ask, is the language stronger than the argument itself? If yes, you probably want to move on. The fourth big trap is restating the premise. This answer, of course, will sound familiar because it literally repeats something the argument already said, which is a dead giveaway that it's not the missing link. Necessary assumptions are unstated. They are behind the scenes. If it's already on the page, it's not the assumption. So for example, if an argument said, all employees want flexible hours, therefore we should offer flexible hours, and the answer said, employees want flexible hours, that was already stated in the premises outright. It's nothing new, nothing assumed. So your fix for this one is, if an answer feels like deja vu, check the stimulus. If it's already there, eliminate it. Now the fifth and final trap is reverse logic, and this one's sneaky. It flips the causal or logical direction and looks right unless you're paying close attention. So for example, the argument says A causes B. A bad answer would say B causes A. It might sound connected, but it's a completely different claim, and not one the author ever relied on. Another variation. The argument says people who do X tend to be Y, and the answer says people who are Y tend to do X. That reversal matters on the LSAT. So your fix for this one is to ask, is this flipping the direction of cause and effect, or is it changing the order of logic? If yes, kill it. Bottom line, the LSAT doesn't just test logic. It tests your discipline, your ability to not fall for choices that feel good, sound smart, or seem kind of related. And once you know these traps, they lose their power over you. You stop reading each answer like it might be right, and you start filtering with intention. That shift, filtering instead of doubting, is how you make fast, accurate decisions under pressure. So let's take everything we've covered so far and put it into action. Here is a real LSAT style argument. Installing solar panels will lower our electricity bill. Therefore, installing the panels will reduce our overall expenses. Simple enough, right? but something feels off. Step 1, let's find the conclusion. Installing solar panels will reduce our overall expenses. That is what the author wants us to believe. It is their final claim. Step 2, find the premise. Installing solar panels will lower our electricity bill. That's the reason they give. So far, it sounds logical. But move on to step 3, spot the gap. And this is where we slow down. Yes, electricity costs might go down, but does that automatically mean your total expenses will go down? Not necessarily. Maybe electricity is a tiny part of your budget. Maybe the panels are super expensive to install. Or maybe you'll need maintenance that costs more than the savings. In short, there is a gap here between saving on your bill and actually saving money overall. That is the assumption. Something must be true for the argument to work. What is it? So let's move on to step 4, predict the assumption. Let's try both types. First, the connector. Electricity costs make up a significant portion of overall expenses. If electricity is only 2% of your spending, saving there isn't really that impactful. So the author has to assume it's big enough to move the needle. Let's look at a blocker as well. No other costs, like installation, maintenance, or other bills, will rise enough to cancel out the electricity savings. If the solar panels cost more to install than they'll ever save, you're not actually saving money. Either of these would be a valid, necessary assumption depending on how the answer choices were worded. Let's move on to step 5, using the negation test. Let's say one of the answer choices is the cost of electricity is a significant component of the household's total expenses. Now negate it. The cost of electricity is not a significant component of the household's total expenses. What happens to the argument? If electricity is a tiny cost, then saving on it won't reduce total expenses in any meaningful way. Boom, the conclusion falls apart. So yes, this assumption is necessary. That is how you test it, and that's how you know, instead of guessing or hoping. Now, the LSAT isn't about being clever, it's about being consistent. If you listened to this argument and thought to yourself, yeah, that makes sense, you're falling into a trap. But if you slow down and you ask, well, wait, what is this argument assuming? You're thinking like the test makers. And when you apply the 5 steps we covered earlier, necessary assumption questions stop being frustrating and start feeling formulaic, and that's exactly what you want. A clear, simple framework that works even when the argument gets weird, technical, or abstract, because at their core, they all follow the same pattern.